The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. This is our last of the Scholar Series for the term. Thank you, Father Spicer. Thanks to a little conversation with Father Spicer, this whole thing started last year, and we resuscitated it after COVID had done a number on the entire world, of course. So we are absolutely delighted to have Professor Anwar Mhajne with us today. I'm just going to give you a very, very brief introduction to her. I've been told I don't say my own name. I'm Uma. I'm the friendly librarian. So let's see. Professor Mhajne has a bachelor's in medical lab sciences. In medical lab sciences from the Ben Gurion University in Israel. She then came on to get a master's in women's gender and sexuality studies. So medical lab sciences to women's gender and sexuality, which of course naturally leads to a doctorate in political science, also from the University of Cincinnati. And then of course she charged off into her wonderful career. 2017, straight after your defending your thesis, she was the UN Security Council monitor for the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and then came to Stonehill in 2018. Of course, Stonehill does not miss a chance to recognize a gem. She comes in 2018. She came as a postdoctoral fellow, became a visiting assistant professor, then the head fellow at the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Social Justice, then an assistant professor of political science, and very, very recently, an associate professor, right?
Technically July.
Oh, sorry, wipe that out. Another 2 months, you know that's going to be real. And all this is in less than a decade, which you know, those of you who are familiar with academia, you know, glaciers run. This is all less than a decade. So this is Anwar. So I said, let me go into her curriculum vitae so I can give you a little more about the research she does. 17 pages long. So, I'm not going to go there, Anwar, but you know that her work has been featured in Foreign Policy, the Jerusalem Post, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's been on NBC Boston, BBC, lots of YouTube videos. For us in the library, Anwar has been a wonderful grant recipient, the recent one this term, where she got us these. Can anyone tell me what that is? Not you, Ed. This is Stonehill's entry into digital humanities. Since the next generation is getting their information in so many different ways, we have a digital humanities librarian right there. Garrett, you want to raise your hand? And we're finding information being passed on and for them to create information in different ways. So Professor Mhajne's entire class came this term and immersed themselves in the virtual reality of a refugee camp. Now think of you as a student studying this in text, and then think of being there, literally. I mean, you move your head around and you see that entire camp. It's just a different experience. So it's a wonderful way for pedagogy to move ahead in that field. And Professor Mhajne has set us off on that. She also does. I'm sorry? I am reserving your wine for after. But Professor Mhajne is also, I mean, she's, as I said, 17-page CV that does not include the fact that she also runs a bar class. She killed me, so I just had to say that. So she just does everything. But today she will be talking to us about her highly awaited edited book on critical perspectives on cybersecurity, published by none other than the Oxford University Press. And are you going to talk about your chapter or about the book as a whole?
I want to talk about the book as a whole.
Wonderful. And Jack, thank you for coming from ECAT. Just to let you know, I say this all the time, our local cable station, ECAT, is going to be filming this, so people who cannot make it today can watch it asynchronously. But if you are in America's Most Wanted, now is the time. So, Professor Anwar Mhajne.
Thank you. She made me sound so cool. Thank you for coming today. I hope you enjoy the wine. She asked me what was my favorite wine, and I said Malbec, so I'm sorry if you don't like it. Today I'm happy to talk to you about an edited volume that just came out in February. This project has taken a couple of years to put together, and it's one of the things that I'm really proud of because not only that the topic is timely, but also the contributions come from a variety of countries, and they cover a variety of areas and issues that I personally care about. So it has a scholarly contribution as well as a contribution to policy as well. The idea for the volume came out. I am a frequent attender of the International Studies Association annual conference, and my previous advisor does study cybersecurity, but he does it from a very traditional sense where it's more about developing spyware, attacking other countries, developing technologies to promote national security. And as a person who does critical stuff and focuses on human rights as well as feminist scholarship, that triggered an alarm. And I started delving into the research on the topic, and I found that that area hasn't been really covered sufficiently by critical scholars. So that was the hope of this volume, is to bring voices that usually are not included within that field, diversify these voices, and also kind of trouble the current scholarship on the topic. So what do we argue? We really are critical of traditional notions of national security. That's the kind of the approach that dominated cybersecurity and the debates on cybersecurity. So we always talk about the Department of Defense when we're talking about cybersecurity. Actually, only recently I was coming back from ISA, and I was on a plane from San Francisco. I was in the middle, and I had two guys sitting on my side, and both of them dealt with cybersecurity. So it was random. One of them actually worked for the Air Force in their cybersecurity division, and then the other one actually was an intelligence officer in Iraq. So it was a different perspective on cybersecurity, and of course the 6 hours went by really quickly because that's all we talked about. But it is because that's kind of the military, Department of Defense, they're paying a lot of attention to cybersecurity. Now they call it as the fifth domain of operations. So you have air, land, sea, and space, and then they added cyberspace. And cyber is not really a separate domain. It kind of covers all these domains. It's important and essential for all these domains. And for national security purposes, this can go as like, as just as little as making sure that the pieces that you use in your weapons and equipment are not, let's say, made in China, or not made in a country that could have a spyware or malware that is on these devices and could affect your operations. Or it could be to like Stuxnet, for instance. I don't know if you've heard of Stuxnet. It's the malware that was in 2010 discovered in Iran's nuclear facilities. Now, nobody officially took credit for it, but you can make conclusions that it's probably Israel and the US. And the malware was one of the first examples of how you're utilizing cyber to attack other countries, like aggressively attack it it wasn't damaging, it was mainly disrupting the operations of centrifuges. So in the facility, the centrifuges kept breaking down, and nobody was sure why. They just kept replacing them. And then they had a system check. A Dutch company came and like, are you aware that there's this thing in your system? And that's when they discovered the malware. Now, the malware is very dangerous because as soon as these cyber weapons are discovered, it means anybody on the web can access them. So you yourself can now go to the dark web and find the code and use it. That's why they're secretive too. That's why countries don't want others to know that they have them. So that was like one of the most radical examples of that, but Russia deployed cyber technology in multiple operations in Georgia. They're using it in Ukraine. We know now in Gaza, Israel deployed multiple layers of AI systems in their identifying of targets, kind of collecting intelligence, as well as deciding on hundreds of targets, which is not traditionally done in kind of wars previously. So there are ethical concerns and questions about the deployment of these weapons. From national security perspective, every state wants to increase the production of these weapons and not regulate them and not disclose them. Because if you do regulate, if you do disclose, that means that you're compromising your ability to use them. A lot of them are dormant, which means that they're sitting in, let's say, critical infrastructure. Let's say you have water, you're trying to protect your water supplies, and somebody could infiltrate the treatment plant, and they could poison your water without you knowing. Or they could turn your electric off. They could turn your transportation off. And that in itself could cause a lot of damage economically and security-wise if that happens. And the downside too is that a lot of these facilities, they are not updated and they don't update themselves constantly, so that is a problem. Now you can hack any car that you're in or you're driving, that's another level. There's also Pegasus, and that's like the cover of the book is a Pegasus. Pegasus is a spyware developed by an Israeli company called NSO. And it's known to be found on a lot of phones of activists, human rights activists in Latin America, in Asia, in other countries, in the Middle East as well. And why Pegasus is different than other spywares, because it could be like right now recording me live without me knowing. So it's not just recording what you have on the phone, it could record you live without you knowing that it's on your phone. And that brought up a lot of ethical considerations. When you develop these tools, who do you sell them to? And how are they being used? So there are lots of ethical considerations where if we move away from state security, we've got to focus on human beings, then it becomes really questionable, right? And that's what we're trying to do with this volume, is to put human into the security element, not just the national security. And sometimes national security means insecurity not only for people outside of that country, but also inside, minority communities, LGBTQI communities, women, depending on what country we're talking about. So these chapters kind of try to problematize notions of national security as important and decenter the state, moving to the human level, and then using what we call intersectional analysis. And what is intersectional analysis? It's a very fancy word. Everyone's like, what does that mean? So intersectional analysis, it means as individuals, our experiences are shaped by multiple layers of identity. So for instance, I'm a woman of color in the US, right? I come from a certain class. I have a certain history, religious background. So all of these things intersect together. Sexual identity, all of it creates a different experience that needs to be It needs to be paid attention to. So intersectionality is taking into account all these layers of power, the matrix, the web that you live in, and kind of try to analyze how these elements affect your experience, which means that you need to focus, it needs situated knowledge that it's contextualized, that takes into account the context, history, and it's very in-depth analysis, relies on case studies than large N data, because in order for you to dissect all these levels, you have to pay attention to stories, to things that you otherwise won't pay attention to. Again, with weaponizing cyberspace, cyberspace, I don't know if you need me to define it, it's usually the digital realm, but it also includes infrastructure. So the internet that you use, the apps that you use, they have, they have data centers, data processing centers, cables that go underwater that connect countries, that connect states, that connect people together. So it takes into account both layers, and anything that happens in that digital realm sometimes is viewed as separate, but now we're trying to connect the physical and the cyber realm. So what happens in cyber, so let's say if one example, let's say a woman who gets cyberbullied, gets exposed to technology-facilitated gender-based violence. So you're being harassed online. That could translate into physical harassment in real life. And that could also result in death and attacks, real attacks on activists, for instance. So we're trying to also problematize this separation between what's cyber and what's physical and view them as an interconnected environment, right? That they're not really separate from each other. So one of the things that we look at: surveillance, data over collection, cybercrime, and cyberbullying. One of my favorite authors, he's a historian at the Hebrew University, and he wrote a lot about data. I don't know if you read his book, *Sapiens*. And he talks about how now data is the most valuable asset that you have. And people, though, don't pay attention to that. Companies are collecting your data, profiting off your data. You don't know what they're doing with your data. And as one of my students told me, she loves that they collect data on them because they like personalized ads to them, right? One student told me that she went to her boyfriend's phone and said, "engagement ring." So the phone can give him ad of engagement ring. I mean, I myself was very alarmed, but it was funny. So what were we doing? This is like the logo of the United States Cyber Command. That's under DoD, but there's another kind of branch under the Department of Homeland Security. What we're trying to do is question the involvement of the Department of Defense, and we're not saying it's not necessary. We're saying that it needs to be regulated. It needs to be human rights centric rather than just let's kind of take care of national security. And when we're talking about national security, we're usually also talking from a Western perspective. So think about all the technology companies that you know. They're based in Silicon Valley, except some Chinese companies, and that's the other competitor, China. And then a lot of networks or a lot of frameworks to protect users as us don't come from international frameworks. They come from country by country basis. And even within the US, there's no really a good data protection framework because of this tension between the federal government and private interests. So private companies don't want to be regulated, and it's really hard to regulate them. California has its own kind of data protection system that is the best one in the US. But the most cited one is the General Data Protection Regulation that the EU has. These companies, again, the majority of them are in the West. All these regulations are in the West, and they're thinking in mind users from the West. Where you trust, well, to some extent, you trust the state, right? But what if you are in an authoritarian context or a dystopian context where we see democratic decline? What happens then if you trust the state and these companies with your data? And that's what we're trying to question. So a human rights-centric approach, what does that mean? Is that you take the human in the context, right? And then you add the regional context and also trying to facilitate these different experiences and find a framework, legal framework to help with that. So we rely on feminist post-colonial theory. What does that mean? What is a feminist theory and post-colonial theory? So feminist theory, it is about power. I know a lot of people view it in terms of men and women, but in IR and international relations, feminist theory is more about power. They say that not only states, but the international system in general is set up in a way where power dynamics that give more say to global north countries, which is mainly Western countries, and less to global south countries that experience colonization. So a lot of British colonies, for instance, post-colonialism emerged from that. So post-colonialism is taking these colonies and the scholarship that came from them, the previous colonies, where they're taking back their experiences. They're resisting those structures that are still in place. Maybe Britain is not colonizing these countries, but the system that was set up economically and also structurally still enforces power dynamics where the global north has more power than the global south in this context. So post-colonial theory tries to kind of flip the script and look at the locals as an important lens rather than looking at the top. right? Which usually is viewed in the global north terms. So we have a wide range of contributions. We have from South Africa, Turkey, people who worked in Afghanistan. We have a chapter on Israel and the West Bank, the Palestinian territories, Latin America. So we try to bring scholars from these areas as well as cover different cases from areas that are outside the West. So with the realist approaches, what I didn't talk about is a few things. There's the defensive versus offensive approaches. And a defensive approach means, like you have protection against being hacked or against being exploited, while offensive meaning that you have the ability to attack other countries or use spyware and malware utilizing these tools. It's usually state-centric, doesn't look at human beings because the security of the state is like the utmost important. And then it's Western-centric. So feminist IRs started actually thinking about science and technology in the 80s. And the argument was that science is gendered, technology is gendered, and they're all embedded in power structures. And that's what I teach my students about, is how science has been developed, the ethical considerations about it. And what we're trying to use this framework and also the critiques of how the neoliberal economy is set up to highlight the problems with current cybersecurity measures, debates, and kind of regulations that, there are barely any regulations, but the regulations that do exist. We also talk about cyber insecurity rather than cybersecurity, because cybersecurity assumes that we're creating a secure space, while actually a lot of these technologies create insecurity for a lot of marginalized groups in that space. So for instance, one way that groups can experience insecurity, well, first of all, malware is that human rights activists are targeted, they don't know about it until somebody like scans their computer. There is, the most famous case is Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist that was killed in a Saudi consulate in Istanbul, I think. Saudi Arabia actually spied on him using that malware. So there are consequences for that. So that's the element of insecurity. But also if you are a woman, for instance, and you're an activist, so I'm writing a paper right now on Iran, how women activists with the Women Life Freedom protest were actually targeted online. And it's not just spying on them, it's manufacturing disinformation and targeting these women specifically with gendered language. So if you live in a culture that emphasizes a lot, honor, virginity, women's respectable behavior, and you can discredit it online as like a promiscuous woman, as somebody who's not legitimate, then they question the legitimacy of your activism. But we also see that here, like in the US, where women get targeted for their appearances, manufactured images, nude images that could affect their the way they address the public. Some women responded to that with not even having accounts online, avoiding being online, and that's a silencing element, right? Of the oppression. That to avoid all of that, you decide not to be online. We see actually a lot of cases in, for instance, the Middle East, where women won't use their own image, they won't use any identifiers in their accounts, just because they're worried about these elements. And sometimes it doesn't come from the state. Sometimes like a guy who likes you or wants to blackmail you into doing something. So that's cyberbullying that could get even out of hand. If you're a member of the LGBTQI community, the state now spies on people based on these apps, dating apps for members of the community, and they're able, in countries that it's criminalized, they're able to track them down, even persuade them to show up at a certain place and then arrest them. So there are a variety of ways how technology could be used as a source of insecurity rather than a source of security, right? Oh boy, it's already almost 4. So with feminists, we also talk about algorithmic bias, and what does that mean? The algorithm, the way the apps are programmed, they are biased in a lot of ways. So for instance, there were programs, AI programs to identify facial recognition programs that are not able to identify faces that are not white correctly. So if let's say you have a picture of a black person, they'll identify any black person under that. They'll misidentify that person, and that's problematic. Also, the way the algorithm learn is from what's out there online, right? We scan the whole internet, and if the internet is full of racism and bias, the the algorithm learns to be that, right? So that's what algorithmic bias is, but we're also now paying attention to how you get like personalized, what we call echo chambers, like the personalized ads, but also personalized news, personalized account suggestions. So that was a big deal during the 2016 election where Russia utilized these spaces to spread fake news. And if you followed one account, then you get more of that. And then you create this like echo chamber where you hear the same thing and you got into like QAnon theories and we got to a situation where democracy was put into question, right? So disinformation is another element, and disinformation, I want to define disinformation versus misinformation. So disinformation is you, not you, or an entity. Russia is very well known to deploy this. You're creating fake news, and you know that you're creating fake news. It's part of information warfare that is very old. But then misinformation is somebody who doesn't know that it's wrong, and then sharing it and sharing it and sharing it, right? So disinformation is more like, I know it's wrong, but I'm going to put it out there and use it with a specific goal, right? We know, like for instance, when the Qatar crisis happened in the Gulf, UAE and Saudi Arabia manufactured news about Qatar, and they put fake news on a website that started the whole crisis, and the region was like this close to a big conflict. So disinformation plays a big role. The U.S. election is coming up, and that's one of the things that actually, part of the national cybersecurity strategy is to think and address disinformation. Now, for feminist scholarship, we also deal with gender disinformation, and that's when the disinformation target female activists, and they are very specific because they target the character of the woman, they target the gender and the sexual identity of these people. And in some contexts, it's more potent than others. But again, if you're a Saudi Arabian activist, if you're an activist from Saudi Arabia and you get like somebody uses AI to manufacture a photo of you that you're like with some guy outside, that is in itself enough to discredit you as somebody who's a legitimate actor that can actually contest the state. So that's kind of some of the stuff that we cover. So one of our first chapters, we use legal frameworks to talk about how to regulate cyberspace while paying attention to, let's say, women in this case. So this was written by Luna Casey. She's based in British Columbia, and Crystal Whetstone. She's based in Bilkent University in Turkey. And they both talked about how there's actually existing frameworks internationally, like the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, that was implemented in early 2000, and there are subsequent laws to bring women into post-conflict and conflict kind of management and peacekeeping operations and peace management. That they use that framework and that kind of legal kind of structure to say that we can extend that to cyberspace and provide protection for women during conflict and post-conflict settings. Because we know gender-based violence increases during conflict, so if it was bad before, it becomes worse during conflict, and because of the toxic masculinity, opportunity, etc., lack of security, lack of state kind of interference and ability to implement the law. And we see that also that translates online, the targeting of minorities, LGBTQI communities during conflict becomes more persistent and more prominent. So that's kind of what the chapter is about. Then we have a chapter written actually by somebody who works for Meta, which is Facebook, previously. Meta is like Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram, because they're owned by the same company. And the other person works for a global internet forum to counter terrorism. And they both kind of critique frameworks that exist right now for data protection, and they highlight how a lot of these protections are actually Western-centric. They're based in the West, and they don't take into account the user's privacy that exists in countries in other places. So one way, for instance, that countries, authoritarian countries, are enhancing their authoritarianism is what we call digital authoritarianism. So one, there's spyware to use against, surveillance to use against activists, disinformation to target activists and manufacture kind of news to help their agenda. But then the third element is to ask for content moderation. So a lot of requests go to these companies, like for Facebook or Instagram or Meta, in the name of counterterrorism. So you can label anybody a terrorist if he's in the opposition, and say, hey, Meta, this is a terrorist, I want their data. And Meta is obligated to respond to international law, but they also have to pay attention to local laws. And what if local laws are specifically targeting minority communities, right? So in this context, you use the label of terrorism and counterterrorism to paint anybody who opposes you as a threat and then get access to their data. And that's what they do. They review 27 regulations and show this dynamic and how it exists and how it enhances authoritarianism. And they call for a legal and international legal framework to guarantee privacy to everybody, right? That is not just based in Europe or based in states in the US. And they define the concept of neocolonialism, novocolonialism, to describe that differences between protection that exists for people in the global north and doesn't exist for people in the global south. Last thing, their argument is that feminist scholarship that pays attention to power, to context, could be a great way to address all these different intersectional identities and experiences and create a framework for data privacy that pays attention to local context. The next chapter, I actually think it was one of the best chapters we had. It was written by somebody who works for ICT for Peace. ICT is like information communication technology. For a second, I need to think about it. So information communication technology, which is really the infrastructure that you have. And she wrote an article about Afghanistan. We don't think about Afghanistan now a lot, but in 2021, when the US left and all the human rights organizations left, they left a lot of data, a lot. So they collected biometric data on people that worked for the government, people who worked with the US military. NGOs collected data because they were doing relief work. First of all, they didn't give these users any ability to delete their data or be able to control how their data is being used. There was no mechanism to delete the data before leaving. So when the Taliban came in, they had access to all the data. All what they needed is maybe there's a password, but all what you need is a hacker to know how to get into the system. So they had access to all that data, and they were able to target opposition, people who worked for the US military, women who were in like positions of power, and we know the crackdown on women right now, that they're specifically targeting women and members of minority communities and other kind of minorities, such as the LGBTQI community. So the chapter kind of brings attention to this thing that we don't think about in post-conflict conflict settings where, okay, we collected this data, we created this element, we have these data to facilitate our work in Afghanistan, it's beneficial to us, but we didn't empower the user or the people that we collected their data to be able to control what happens to the data. And we didn't create mechanism to delete the data when we have to leave really quickly. And that created a situation of insecurity that nobody's really talking about enough, right, in this context. So they know their addresses, what they're doing. A lot of people started deleting their Facebook accounts and Instagram accounts. So there was a chaotic situation. I know somebody in Afghanistan who eventually was able to make it outside, and she sent me a picture outside of her house with like the Taliban outside of her house looking for her. Because she was a women's rights activist, and they knew where her press was, they targeted her press. So kind of this one element that people don't think and talk about enough when we're covering data. So she uses the term techno-colonialism, but it's the same as kind of a colonialism that is implemented in technology or facilitated with the use of technology. Another chapter that I also think is important, I think the whole edited volume is important, just FYI. But one of this chapter is by Murat Yilmaz, my friend Murat. He's a Turkish scholar, and he studies the Uyghur minorities in China. I don't know if you know much about them, they're a Turkic minority that China has been putting in camps. They call education camps, but they've been committing multiple human rights abuses, trying to re-educate them, dilute their cultural identity. They accused them of terrorism. I mean, there were a few terrorist attacks against the Chinese government, but they have 1 million people in camps. And this chapter talks about how China extends that authoritarianism to diaspora Uyghur communities. So when they left, now China can monitor and trace them anywhere they are, anywhere in the world, right? And If you're a woman, again, that's another different dynamic of how they're controlling you and able to manipulate the information that you get. So the chapter kind of focuses on digital authoritarianism and focuses on gender as well as an element of how how the Chinese government is monitoring the Uyghur community that left and trying to control the narrative as well. One chapter we have from, it's about Kenya. It takes a kind of a different lens where it looks at how women actually use nudity as a way to counter state and societal control of them online. So this is a resistance element there. And it talks about how these women use it as a tool for economic empowerment, for challenging disciplinary powers. She uses Foucault's discussion of disciplinary power that requires society, the state, and other kind of factors to discipline people into behaving in a certain way. So in this context, using interviews and also WhatsApp chat groups, they were able to make an argument for how that becomes a form of resistance to these disciplinary powers, and like methods of deleting, adding, changing profiles, and multiple tactics that they used. Then that's my chapter. I do talk about international humanitarian law, and I mainly focus on surveillance in checkpoints in the West Bank. There is a huge system, it's called the Wolf Pack. So there's Blue Wolf, Red Wolf, there's White Wolf. The way they do it is they collect biometric data in these checkpoints, so face and other biometric data, sometimes without the consent of the people. So like there's a story of soldiers going around and taking pictures of Palestinians and uploading it to the database without the consent. And then when people cross the checkpoints from point A to point B, that system kind of identifies who they are and gives them like a green check or red check or whatever, if they should be interrogated more, etc. And we know that there's a bigger application right now with a program called Lavender that was used in Gaza recently. Lavender identifies faces, it's a facial recognition program to identify Hamas combatants, but it has a 10% chance of misidentifying. And also it doesn't care about civilian casualties. So let's say you identify a Hamas, like mid-rank or lower rank Hamas operative, you know where they are, you see that they have kids around them, you see that they have people, is it at night in their houses, not in combat setting, it just gives the green light that this is it, hit the target. So that's kind of just a new revelation that came out, I think last month. So again, the chapter is trying to use international humanitarian law that deals with occupation settings and the responsibility of the occupier to provide privacy, but it doesn't talk about data privacy, right, specifically. Data privacy wasn't mentioned in this framework. So there's a push for including data privacy in this narrative and giving people control over their data. So for instance, if the database that has all the biometric data was hacked, Palestinians don't have the right to access that. Or to know about, to know that their data were hacked. So it talks about that system of how technology is being used in a way to facilitate the occupation, and it disregards, again, these people that exist in these spaces. It's like uses CCTV cameras, it's an elaborative system, especially in East Jerusalem. It's very, like, cameras are everywhere and they collect data on everybody without their consent. So there's a question of what is the responsibility of occupying powers under international humanitarian law framework to protect data privacy. And also there's the question of manipulating data and also blocking people access to information technology. So like if you turn the internet off, right, that could also have humanitarian consequences for people. So the chapter kind of delves into that legal framework. I'm happy to chat about it in the Q&A if you have questions. I'm taking too much time. And the last chapter is focusing on Latin America and the use of surveillance, specifically Pegasus, the program, against human rights activists. So there's work on Mexico that is big right now because the Mexican government targets journalists with Pegasus. And I was at a panel that actually talked about how the government mainly attacks journalists that have high profile. You know, they can't just kill them. So they plant Pegasus on their phones. But if you're a lower ranked journalist, then you go missing, right? It depends on how many followers you So that's that chapter kind of covered it in the context of Latin America in general. I highly recommend. So to conclude, the chapters in this volume kind of use an intersectional post-colonial and feminist analysis and shows that it's very important lens to study cybersecurity. And we know that cyber and physical, they're not really separate, they bleed into each other. It's also essential to show us how power dynamics in cyberspace shape the lived experiences of different individuals, groups, communities, and states. The insistence of feminists that power relations matter, that situated knowledge is essential, and that objectivity is questionable gives feminists practical tools to comprehensively analyze the colonial, gendered, racialized, and classed effects of cybersecurity practices, which is directly tied to data privacy and digital surveillance. So we look at human rights, but I think the most important questions that were asked, or we're asking, inviting people to ask, was whose security are we talking about? Security from what? And security about what means. So a cybersecurity framework that is not centered on protecting digital rights must be revised. And the chapters remind us that cybersecurity processes must be inclusive, multidisciplinary, context-specific, and intersectional. It must decenter the state and its narrow definition of cybersecurity as national security. So I'm going to pause here and give you time for questions. Thank you. I'm waiting for the host.
Oh, no, I was going to ask you. Are there questions over here? Maybe I can bring a mic.
I think this works, huh? I don't know. You have to turn it on, probably.
Questions, people? This works. I'm sorry.
You do it without the mic.
You could, but then you have to project unhappiness.
You're going to be a celeb on local news or local TV. Sorry.
I have a very simple question. Is there any hope? No, I'm not being facetious. You know, are the forces out there that are recognizing these concerns, and is there any movement towards regulating or reining in this movement?
That's an important question. And to be honest with you, it's been really difficult. So for weaponry, it's been harder than other things. So for instance, anything that's related to AI and weapons, it's hard to regulate. Cyber weapons are hard to regulate because states don't want to regulate them. It doesn't matter if it's a democratic state, if it's an authoritarian state, it doesn't matter. They don't want to because they want to have that arsenal and be able to use it. And that has been really difficult at the international level, at the UN level, to create a framework. But also there are contesting views of what cybersecurity looks like. So there's China and Russia that focus more on information security, which means that the state want to have the right to control what comes out of their countries and what stays in. They want more control over the information. While the US and the EU, they want to more focus on kind of users and what they're doing with their data. And since they are important players in the international system, they compete a lot and clash, and they don't regulate. Another big debate on laws, which is lethal autonomous weapons. Now, lethal autonomous weapons don't have to have like a cyber element. They could be like mines. You step on it and kind of explodes. But the ones that are powered by AI, now it's a huge deal because nobody wants to regulate them. But they need to be regulated because like if an AI makes a decision on who to target, how to target, when to target, then first of all, who's being held accountable? What is like kind of the chain of responsibility there? And then, you know, can like a commander say, well, it's not my fault, I didn't, you know, the AI decided, so the AI rules. Some people claim that human review the decisions before an AI approve it, but now that's questionable. If you're like using it to target hundreds of targets a day, how many humans, like how much do you like have time to review? Two, do you actually care about human casualties? Because if you don't care, I mean, it doesn't matter, right? So these are important questions, and I think the US and DoD just like President Biden issued an AI, the executive order on AI, but it was still not on weapons or anything that is substantial. The US mainly focused on private companies having the right to regulate and create frameworks of their own. That is problematic. I mean, it's good in a certain way, but it's also bad in another, because private companies will not do that unless they're profiting from it, unless people know about it, right? So if users don't know that a hack or something happened, and if it's not beneficial to them, then why would they invest time into these regulations? And also there's lack of communication between different levels. So in the US, the private multi-stakeholder approach. So the private companies, state, and then you have the federal level, and how do you reconcile all these levels together, and then you have the international level. So there are multiple questions. A lot of countries don't want to regulate them. They don't think it's advantageous to their national security. And that's where a lot of people are arguing that the UN should push for this, like a multi-stakeholder approach at the UN level to try to figure out a framework. There are now lots of civil society organizations working on pushing for digital rights. There is a move to document all these abuses. And private companies tend to respond to some point if there is pressure from users. So one thing that, for instance, during the Palestinian-Israeli debate, the whole hashtag and like social media narrative that exists, one way, for instance, activists tried to force Facebook to stop censoring content. They went on the App Store and they gave Facebook 1 star. So the value of the company dropped drastically after that campaign. Very simple campaign, right? And then they had to start responding and apologizing, and like they have the oversight board that now takes cases into context. Another issue is that these companies are not familiar with cultural context. So for instance, I had to review something for the board. It was a case of like a woman in Iraq, an activist, and somebody reported the post. The activist was accused of being promiscuous, calling her names, and I'm not gonna cite right now. And they're like, should we remove this? I was like, if you knew the cultural context, you would remove it, right? Like immediately. But it's just these tiny, and like for instance, if you're in Saudi Arabia and you show a little bit of skin, that's totally different than you're in Lebanon or in Jordan, right? So the fact that they're not aware of the also cultural context is very problematic. With content moderation, they only have a few people who speak Hebrew and Arabic. Like how can you moderate a very contentious issue right now if you don't have enough people to moderate it? Twitter within the first few days since October 7th, like the first that weekend, had millions of tweets about the conflict. And Twitter, when Elon Musk took over, he removed all the content, like he reduced the team that does content moderation, fact checking reduced that. So he had to turn that on. He was like, okay, we can't, like we need to do this. Because disinformation, misinformation, you'll see videos from Syria being used, images in Gaza attributed to Israel or Israel to Gaza. You'll find, videos from movies that are assumed, like one of them is the biggest thing that Palestinians are faking their wounds. And they posted a video of a movie set, and they claimed that was in Gaza. And then, after investigative journalists done their work, it was a movie set in Lebanon. So there's a lot that is going on online that, also it's hard to control for a variety of reasons. First, private companies like run by Elon Musk, he doesn't want to do content moderation, freedom of speech, right? And then where do we draw the line? And that's another thing that's important to think about. Yeah. I don't know, that's a long answer.
So the answer is no.
I don't want to say no.
That's true.
I have a question. Anwar, there's so much going on this week with student activists in New York and Texas and whatnot. Are folks, can you hear me? Okay. Are those folks subjected, do you think, to any surveillance, the use of any of these tools?
Well, I hope the U.S. is not doing that. But we know from the Snowden revelation that they've been monitored. What I'm worried about more is the disinformation that's going around than surveilled. I think that's a bigger issue right now with, okay, what's really going on, what's not going on, who's representing what. So there are different narratives that exist online. It's hard to kind of figure out what's true and what's not unless you are actually there. So that's one of the things that I'm concerned about. Like I don't make a comment because it's like I'm not there, so I can't tell you, and I don't trust anything online. I really don't. The more I know, the more I don't know. if that makes sense. So I don't know, like I'm not there, so I can't tell. And I'm asking friends like, please go check, because they live in New York. But yeah, that's the most, I think in this context, it's more of like what's being reported, how it's being reported, and how true it is. These are the questions that need to be asked. Yeah. As somebody who reads Hebrew, English, and Arabic, I can tell you it's just the Wild West out there.
You read Hebrew and Arabic and English?
Yeah, well, so I am a Palestinian citizen of Israel, so we're 2 million that stayed there after 1940. We weren't, like my great-grandparents didn't leave. Okay.
What is your take on the TikTok controversy?
Oh, that's an interesting thing. So with TikTok is a big national security issue. Why? A lot of students are not going to like it. Because unlike the US, and that's the bad part about the government controlling private businesses, in China, the government controls private businesses. So whatever data TikTok has access to, in theory, China could have access to and can. And I had a Chinese student a few semesters ago who told me that TikTok for Chinese, like kids at least, is totally different than TikTok that is in the US, where the content is more of nationalistic, like pro-party content, so then trying to indoctrinate the kids into that nationalist narrative. Well, in the US, the content varies, but we also know a lot of disinformation is on TikTok. A lot of very weird challenges that get the kids sick, and also location data, preferences, spreading disinformation, manipulating public opinion. So there are security risks, and I buy that, to why maybe like this is a legitimate discourse to have about regulating TikTok, just because of the control structure that exists.
Anyone else?
I'd like a little more hope, I guess.
I don't know.
You say you take every piece of news information with a heavy grain of salt, but are there any apps? I use one called Ground News, which analyzes all the sources that report it based on their political leanings. And there are a couple of others like that try to find a balance to work for us. Is there anything out there that you could recommend?
Honestly, for me, I just read sources in multiple languages. For me, it's the greatest exercise. Like, just even like trying to translate something from another source about a different topic, or no, sorry, the same topic, different news outlets, different languages covering the same issue, and you see kind of parallel worlds. It's like different universes. Like they're experiencing the same thing in theory, but they're viewing it differently, right? And for me, that's what I do. Digital literacy is important to be like. I'm telling you, one time I deleted Facebook because one time I got an ad where I got a news article that looked like the Washington Post. Clicked on it. I was like, wait, this title doesn't seem like the Washington Post because I know what they are, what they represent. So I look up on the address, and it wasn't the WashingtonPost.com. It was like the WashingtonPost.org or not. I don't know what it was. So it's that tricky. It was the same font, the same page, just in the like address. It was just dot something else. So I don't know. I mean, I think diversify your source is good. Leaning is good, but sometimes even leaning is not enough, right? And if you can read other languages, I highly recommend it.
Yeah, for those of us who don't read other languages or don't do it easily, there are news agencies like Reuters, which is mainly European-based, Al Jazeera.
So that's a good thing. Like Al Jazeera has English, but it's still like mainly Middle East based. If you like want to balance it out with other sources and like see the different coverage of the issue, yeah.
Just good timing.
Is it done?
Do we have any more questions? One last question? A hopeful question? I forgot. And thank you, Professor Mhajne. She was able to get us some copies at a huge discount. So if any what you've talked about, if you really want to sow your wrist, you should be getting one of those.
Thank you.
Thank you.